The Scottish independence referendum in mid-September taught us, if nothing else, about how fluid British identity is. David Bowie, who used Kate Moss as his Brit Award representative to call for Scotland to stay within the UK, is known as a master of changing identity. But why did someone known for revolutionary pop music opt for the status quo? And what does his journey from music hall act to elder rock statesman demonstrate? Joining me here in the studio is Simon Critchley, a professor of philosophy at the New School in New York, who's just written a book called Bowie. Welcome to Going Underground. Simon, let's begin with what actually inspired you to choose Bowie as a subject.
The book is a love letter or a piece of fandom, really. I've been a Bowie fan since I was 12 years old. So it's just an attempt to try and make sense of that.
Slightly different to the normal fan books, it has to be said, I hope.
Yeah, well, I'm not the normal fan, I suppose. It's an exploration of his work, but it's not music journalism. It's not dime store psychology. There's no biographical revelations. There's no sort of bad social history. It's an attempt to try and write about music, and in particular his music, in a way that does some justice to it. That's really what I'm trying to do.
On the social history angle, how do you see Bowie's changes synchronizing with changes in British society? Or do they?
The big shift is a shift from the late 60s to the early 70s, when Bowie becomes famous overnight. July the 6th, 1972, and he's on Top of the Pops, does Starman, and a quarter of the British population watch that show, and then suddenly he's a star. This androgynous, strange character appears. Bowie becomes something. There's also something about his work that's profoundly dystopian. The vision of the world is a kind of ruined, catastrophic place, and the whole idea of Starman and all the rest, the whole idea of aliens, which is there in Bowie's work, is a reflection on the fact that the world is a kind of decayed, ruined, collapsed place, very different from the kind of peace, love, and revolution message of the 1960s. So Bowie's work is dystopian, has a rather sort of nihilistic view of the world, and that sort of came into vogue at a certain point in the early 70s when that made sense.
Is he a figure of the right? Here's David Bowie saying no to independence for Scotland, he's a tax exile. You're talking about the kind of nihilism people talk about, F.R. Leavis-style, T.S. Eliot nihilism, where Britain is a mess and it will never be better.
The world's a mess. I mean, it's politics. I don't know, and I don't really go into it in the book. I mean, there is this famous moment which he then regretted in the mid-70s when he appeared at Victoria Station and was photographed as what appeared to be a Nazi salute, and then at a certain point said that he'd make a very good candidate for Prime Minister, and made certain remarks that were kind of fascistic. But he later regretted that. But at that point in the mid-70s in Britain, it was a strange world. I mean, there'd been a Labour government more or less in charge for the last generation. There was trash in the streets, things had fallen apart, and there was a sense in which that national dimension was foregrounded in a very kind of odd way that made right and left quite difficult to judge. With perfect 2020 hindsight, we can say all sorts of things about it, but it was different back then. After Thatcher was elected, things changed. But his politics, I don't know. I think he's all right. He's a good guy.
But do you think it's strange that a philosopher from the New School, the proponents of the Frankfurt School, quasi-Marxist, would you say?
I'm not
writing
Marxist.
Writing a book
Yeah.
on Bowie and not tackling the politics? Because is it more you're interested in the idea of spectacle and how he is a sign of the times?
I think it's a sign of the times in the sense in which I think that the world is a kind of crazy place, and we're going through now a period of kind of collapse. I think a kind of collapse, a disintegration of certainly the entire world that I grew up with and knew. And this is a very strange, chaotic moment, and to that extent, Bowie's vision in the 70s actually has a certain purchase on the present, I think.
I mean, you do think he's a liberating artist. Is that confined then to ideas of identity rather than class, ironically?
I think Bowie is someone that spoke to working class English boys and girls in a spectacularly powerful way, in a way that allowed them to realize that their domestic world with their mother. There's a wonderful moment in two movies, in Velvet Goldmine, where the Christian Bale character sees Bowie on television, or the Bowie character on television. And there's also the moment at the beginning of a movie, Control, about Ian Curtis and Joy Division. And if you look at both those films, there was something about Bowie that allowed you to realize, yes, I identify with him, right? And not with this kind of stuff this world that I'm in with my family and the town, this grey, cramped, dull place in Biggleswade or whatever.
Because he doesn't write, I mean, one could say On Space Oddity or the older albums, there were social observations of gaps in wealth. I think there was some elements in the 90s as well, in some albums that you said that you hate in the book. But he's not writing about South London suburbs or the inner cities in America, because of course he went to America then. Well,
there's songs like Panic in Detroit where he's talking about that, but we didn't want that. I mean, part of the point I'm making in the book is that, it wasn't about the streets. It wasn't about Bowie was a way of liberating oneself from the world that one inhabited. He didn't want kind of realism. He didn't want to be reminded of the street. You're in the street, and it was awful.
Okay, for those trying to reclaim, though.
But, Bowie offered a kind of impossible glamour and strangeness and sexual weirdness and attraction, and it offered something else, a kind of alien presence that took you somewhere else. There was somewhere apart from here that felt good.
Okay, if someone is trying to reclaim them, you mentioned in the book this concept of Heathen, which was an album, but a couple of albums ago.
2001.
But there are enemies in his work, which I have to say your book revealed to me, I didn't realize. There are enemies. I mean, he's profoundly anti-religious, I think.
There's an antipathy towards organized religion, persistent references to the church, in particular the Catholic Church. There's a very interesting song called Loving the Alien, which itself the title is revealing, which is about the Crusades and the folly of the Crusades. So there are, and he is married to a woman who's from a Muslim family. So there is a persistent critique of organized religion. It comes out in one of the videos that followed the next day, the Gary Oldman video, where he plays a corrupt priest. So that keeps coming up, but there's also a religiosity to Bowie's work, which I try and focus on in the book, a kind of spirituality, if you like, which is once we see through the kind of corruption of organized religion, we can perhaps have access to some truer religiosity. I think there is an aspect of that in Bowie.
And just finally, just quickly, is it the music of political disappointment then, ultimately?
Yes. Yeah, it is. It's a music of political and religious disappointment. It's a way in which Bowie allowed us to see through this world and imagine something else. And for me, as a dirty little punk in London in the 1970s running around, and Bowie never stopped being cool. Everybody else stopped being cool. The Beatles, the Stones, all those monstrous progressive rock bands. But Bowie never stopped being cool and became a script for us for how we inhabited this kind of decaying, faded world that we kind of, we found ourselves within and we wanted to creatively destroy. So Bowie was a way of giving voice to a disappointment, very much so.
Professor Simon Critchley, thank you.
Thank you very much.